When it comes to learning historical European martial arts, also known as HEMA, there's nothing better than finding a good, qualified instructor to teach you the foundational principles of using a sword. However, even when you're able to find such an instructor, many of them are honestly just not as aware of certain aspects of using a sword. One example of this would actually be using the sword in the cut. And using a sword in cutting is actually a very, very fine skill set that many instructors themselves have not even learned. So what happens when you run into that? You're either self-learning, self-teaching, or even your instructor may not be as aware as they need to be. Well, you have to turn to someone who is. And thankfully, we can now do that, thanks to this book by Michael Edelson, Cutting with the Medieval Sword. Mike Edelson is actually known for quite a few things within the HEMA community. To a lesser extent, he's known for being something of a curmudgeon, and I think that's mostly just kind of a show he puts on, but it is part of his interesting personality. You can certainly see this if you ever look at any of his presentations or lectures. But I think he's actually much more well known for being someone who is extremely good at using a sword to cut. He won tournaments years ago, and then he moved on to judging. And certainly at an event like Long Point, he is one of the primary judges and has been for as long as I can remember. And he understands the fundamental elements to a degree that I think many people within the community don't. Some of that comes from his background doing martial arts outside of historical European martial arts and focusing on the use of like the katana and those type of things. And he's been able to adopt some of those things, bring them over. But on top of that, on top of all of that, he's also known for being a very good author. Now, that's a very odd thing because, to my knowledge anyway, I don't know that he's ever actually directly written a book such as this. Now, he's written books before, but they've been fiction books. He's actually got a really good one that's using HEMA tournaments as kind of a background for a mystery thriller called the Talhofer Society. I recommend you go check that one out. But he's never written kind of a manual type book, and that's very often been left to a lot of other people, but I think he's the right person to write this book. And here's why. He understands how to take everything from the very beginning and bring you up to a level of mastership, but he also knows how to correct people. And that is to say, when they are doing something wrong, he knows how to tweak and move them back towards where they should be. And that's very hard to do in a book, but he does it very successfully here. Now, the structure of the book is actually written with a short preface section and then 3 modules. One module is based on theory, and these are the foundational principles as well as the basic mechanics of how to cut. And I think this is actually the bread and butter of this book. I think if you were to just read this section, you could still get a ton out of it. But then he goes on to write 2 more modules. One is a module on practice, that is how to take all the theory and make it practical in your kind of daily training and to become good at using a sword in the cut. And then he finally has a section on calibration, and that is using cutting targets and getting to the point where you can kind of self-teach and self-learn and, more importantly, self-correct. So I want to tackle each of those modules in and of themselves in this review, but before I do that, I want to just speak to what is covered in the preface. Now, in the preface, there are the kind of typical things you'd expect: about the author, a foreword, in this case written by Jake Norwood, and then you get some kind of fundamental basics on how to read the book, and it even has a how-to section in terms of how this book is going to apply. And Mike's recommendation is that you never really read this book just cover to cover per se, although that's exactly what I did. But it is more of how to use it as a manual, and that is an expectation that you're going to actually skip around to some extent. You're going to go back to what you've learned. But certainly you can read it cover to cover and get a lot out of it, but you should never just stop there. The value of the book goes in its continual usability. He also covers a couple things to talk about And this is actually kind of a living book. That is, they have revisions, and new revisions will probably come out on a regular basis, and that's okay. And that means that you'll have to go online, find a download for it potentially. The ebook version gets automatic updates, so while a physical version is great, and I love physical versions of books because you can flip them open. At class you can open it up and point to things. You don't have to bring out a tablet. I think that this is one of those cases where digital version actually has some distinct advantages in terms of being regularly updated. But then he goes into some of the basic things you would expect, how to use a sword in general. That is, what parts of swords you have, general grips, those types of things. And he doesn't go too much in depth in those. And I think that's really a focus on just getting people who maybe especially aren't really experienced in German sources, kind of getting them up to speed. This is very much written on a focus on the longsword as just kind of the basic vanilla package, and it's using German longsword. So those who are Italian practitioners might have a little bit more difficulty with terminology, etc. I don't think it's a huge issue, although I do think that you do need to have some foundational basics. All that's covered in the preface, and then you're going to dive right into the bread and butter of this book, which is the theory section. The theory module is focused on providing you with all the information you need to know about what makes a good cut, what makes an effective cut. And this covers a myriad of topics. It speaks to basic things like edge alignment and how the edge should be appropriately aligned to the target and the kind of angle of the cut. And it speaks to axis of rotation and understanding based on what you're doing with your body mechanics, where you're actually setting an axis of rotation, and whether that's in your hands holding the sword or if it's actually in your body and your entire arm and sword being one is rotating around that axis. But it also covers other things. There's a little bit of a concept of sword dynamics in there, mostly focused on the idea of center of percussion. And even some of the theory behind that begins to fundamentally change your position on how you think about these things. My example of that would be that when speaking of the theory or the kind of theoretical principles behind the center of percussion, that is where the mass transfers. And Mike actually speaks to one of the things that I know is a bit of a controversial thing sometimes about vibration nodes, and that vibration node helps you to understand where that center of percussion would be, transmits the least amount of energy to your hand and the most to your target. But then he actually goes on to say that's not necessarily what you want to use to cut a target. And it gives some reasons on the theory behind that. The theory roughly going that just because the center of percussion is where that primary energy transfer can happen at the maximum possible amount, it doesn't mean that in the reality of a fight, that's where you're going to try to cut with. Very often, swords actually have that center of percussion much closer to the center of the overall blade length, and that's just not sufficient. You can't necessarily close that distance, and it's not wise to close that distance. So you're actually theoretically, for the purposes of getting a good solid cut, but also keeping yourself safe, you're not going for maximum efficiency there. And that understanding of how that theory applies to practical reality is extremely important to understand. And there's a lot of things like that in this theory section. You just have to kind of wade through and you really have to absorb. And I feel like this is a section that I honestly learned how little I know. Certainly there are other sections of the book I learned, I could do this, I could do that, I understand this better. But this is the one that told me I don't know what I don't know. And that I have a lot to kind of relearn and a lot of good ways to rethink, because I've always considered center of percussion. That's where you want to strike with, but then in practice, in reality, I know that doesn't really work that way. So I think this is an invaluable section, and while it may not be my absolute favorite section, as I'll talk about in a bit, I think it's probably one of the most useful sections. And so it may not be as enjoyable, but boy, because of how useful it is to just kind of understand what goes into the mechanics of a cut, not just in theory, but then also how that theory can begin to turn into practice in the next section, it really helps build that fundamental understanding that you need to know. So you not only can you identify what you're doing right, but then you can identify what you're doing wrong, and you can apply some principles and theory behind that. But nothing is good when it's just theory. It matters as well when you get to practice. The practice section is written in such a way that you're able to apply what you learn, but in a kind of a slow burn process. So you have all the theory, and you'll need to constantly refresh yourself on the theory. But in order to really apply it, you have to build muscle memory. You have to really hone and refine your body mechanics. And because of that, it's very hard for me to give kind of a full review on this section, because I'd have to spend a lot of time before I'd ever get around to actually reviewing the book. So I'm going to actually really only kind of glaze over this section, and as I'll note later on, kind of close to the end of this video, I'll be revisiting this book after a bit of time to give a more full review. So this section, it teaches you a bit about what you need to do it. He recommends things such as dowels instead of just swords as a stand-in for a few scenarios. That you also get or make a pel, and that's not just a post type pel, but also maybe a hanging pel. And there are things you can do to learn on these things that are very basic and honestly very repetitive, but that's necessary for the kind of purpose of building the good body mechanics and really focusing on doing it right and learning correctly. And I don't want to get into too many details on the very specifics of these books, because honestly, you should buy the book for that. I would be undercutting Mike's work to actually tell you exactly what all is covered and all the details of it, but I will give you some examples. So one example I would give is that most people know, generally speaking, how to grip a sword, and Mike talks a good bit about lengths of the grips and how having your hands closer together on the grip is actually good for a lot of reasons. One, though, is to make sure that when your arms are extended, you don't kind of fall into poor practices. And this is something we in the HEMA group, or HEMA community, have learned really incorrectly, because we have much longer grips to facilitate things such as gloves, and that teaches us to cut kind of incorrectly. So you kind of have to unlearn some things there. But then he also goes into things such as how to breathe in the cut. And you can take breaths and then get the breath out when you're in the cut, and it helps you to not just generate energy and kind of have a good focus, but it doesn't then interact or interrupt with the good body mechanics you're supposed to be doing. And how to generate power, which is actually a very difficult thing. One of the most interesting things that I've seen at tournaments is people who are able to cut tatami mats and do so with very, very little kind of room to maneuver or build momentum, and that's all from good generation of energy. And he shows things such as how to use what's really these bottom two fingers in order to kind of give yourself, in the squeeze, to give yourself a bit of a push, to get that tip out in front, to get your arms extended properly and get a good cut. And certainly the way this is written, I have no problem with understanding exactly what he's saying. This can be a real challenge in teaching people drills or teaching people how to do something in a book format, because to some extent you're relying on them to interpret what you're writing correctly in a way that they can self-teach. And Mike has a real skill with this. He can very, very precisely and concisely say how to do something. And in you reading, like, that makes perfect sense, and I can understand why that would be hard, and I understand why I needed to kind of repeat this. And there are times as well that you read it and you go, oh, that'd be easy, I'm pretty sure I could do that. And that's exactly when he then cautions you and says, don't get cocky here. Don't think that you've mastered it yet. Take the time, spend the time, do the slow burn. Don't allow it to be something that you try to rush, because you'll learn incorrectly. This section, I think, is extremely good for kind of classroom settings as well as some solo practice. These are drills that you can interject if you're teaching a class, or if you're running a class. You can interject these drills into the midst of everything else that you're learning within the HEMA knowledge base, and then apply it slowly over time again. So again, hard for me to review this section beyond just saying I think it's really well written. I think it's very clear. What he needs to talk about, he talks about, and the things that he doesn't, he says it's outside the scope of this book. If you really need to know all the details of how to make a pel, don't look at this book. Instead, go research it online, and then go build a pel. It's not that hard. So, practice section, it's really good. I look forward to applying it to what I do on a weekly basis, and then I'll get back to you guys in maybe future review on my full thoughts on these aspects. The final module of this book is the calibration module. Now, most people at this point probably would think, when am I ever going to get around to actually cutting something? Because a lot of what is covered in both the theory and practice sections are honestly able to be done without a target. You do them just to air in front of you, and you listen to the way the sword kind of whistles through the air, and you try to gain some things in terms of good mechanics against maybe a Pell, but you're never actually cutting a target. And once you get into this third module, it's no longer about the act of cutting, it's about the act of calibration. And that is, you are taking what you have learned in everything else in this book, and you begin to refine it. You begin to self-correct. So this is the self-correcting part of the book. It's also what I would say is going to lead up to the more expensive part of learning how to cut. I mean, maybe besides buying a really good sword, you're going to be cutting through things. You're going to be eating up those resources. So if you're using something like a tatami mat, those have a certain price point with them, and you use them up and you can't use them again. So everything he goes through in this section is really focused on everything you need to know to not only get to the point of cutting something like tatami, but also how to actually read it, to do what is basically called forensics in this case. And I want to step through just kind of what's covered. Again, not going too much into detail. You should read the book for that. He does cover basic things like how to build a tatami stand. That is a small stand that has a spike that you place the tatami mat on. But again, he also then says you want super duper details on this. Again, go research it online outside the scope of the book. He talks about how to roll tatami. He talks about how to sharpen swords. He talks about how to care and maintain for the swords. But then he goes into what I think is some of the more interesting things, which is how to cut through tatami, what you're going to actually experience doing so, especially when it's your first time doing it. He also covers things such as patterns for cuts, so you don't just do the same cut over and over and over again, although there are times you should. In that you can actually vary up the patterns, and you can vary up whether you're using the long or the short edge of the sword. And then he also talks about how to then read the tatami mats, do the forensics, and understand what may have gone right and what may have gone wrong. And with all of these sections kind of combined, you actually have a really good, solid, fundamental understanding of how you're supposed to be using tatami mats. And so here's the thing, this is actually really interesting for me because I use tatami mats all the time. It's part of what I do in terms of reviewing swords. And this is actually a unique challenge for me because it means that I might be learning a lot of things incorrectly, both by the nature of using a lot of different swords, as well as maybe not always having the best mechanics, and not always having my focus being cutting well with the sword, but getting the cuts through and making it all work for a video. So I have a lot to actually learn myself here. And this is probably, I would hope for me, is actually one of the more valuable sections because I'm uniquely set to be able to self-correct and do some things, but I still need to go back and learn to, unlearn maybe some of the things I've done wrong. But certainly then going through and doing the cuts on the tatami, I need to spend more time actually paying attention to what I've done, reading the tea leaves as it were, and trying to understand what I can do better. So this is probably actually one of my favorite sections, although theory section I think is the most valuable. And he's covered everything in this last section. And to some extent, this is the section that seems to be the one that speaks the most to what you're doing with the sword itself, in terms of care, maintenance, what to look out for, things that are good, things that are bad. But it is a really interesting section, and I think it is invaluable, if nothing else, for the great charts of like how to cut the tatami mats in certain patterns, and the great visual indicators of how to read them. Because I don't think it's hard to understand, but it's certainly hard to have that eye for what's going on exactly. And having read this section especially, I begin to understand a lot more than I did exactly what happens in the cutting tournaments, especially the ones that Mike is responsible for judging, because the things they do I see all throughout this book. I understand why they do cuts that are meant to show power generation and cuts that are meant to show the ability to control the sword in confined and kind of small spaces, and the reasons that they would have people cut through 3 mats that are set in a row versus just 1 mat. And all these things actually have distinct value and distinct purpose, and it's all covered in this 3rd module that is the calibration module. When you have finally read this book and you're able to sit back and you're able to think about it a bit, and you're ready to then go out and apply it to your day-to-day practice, you really are left with a very interesting sense of just how good an author Mike actually is. And that's very strange because it's one thing to be a fiction author, and then it's a whole other thing to be kind of a non-fiction, kind of practical application author. But he knows how to be precise and concise in what he's saying. He gets it right to you so you can learn it. He gets it right to you so you can apply it. And he gets it right to you so you can learn to refine what you're doing. So as I go through this book over the next year, year and a half, however long it takes me to become really good at cutting and cutting properly, not just getting through the target. So as I learned from Mike in this book, that's actually the easy part. It's easy to get through the target. What's hard is getting through the target in a way that's valuable. Because while tatami mat's easy to get through, and it's not really, as the myth would suggest, a stand-in for like the human arm or something, it is something that helps to kind of show what you're doing wrong, and that while you might be able to get through a mat, getting through like a human might not be so easy. You might get your sword stuck. You might even break your sword. And so it's one of those things where, I've got a lot I've got to learn here, and I want to learn how to do this better. So one of the challenges I'm going to put for myself is in any future sword review I do, no matter what type of sword, I'm going to try to make sure I'm doing good body mechanics, good cuts with it. Make sure the sword is properly sharpened. That's actually something he covers in this book pretty in depth, which is really good because most people don't know how to sharpen a sword. And as I apply this over the next year, year and a half, I'm going to have to come back to you guys. I'm going to have to do kind of review 2.0 on this book, because I don't know that I can give my full insight into how good this book is, how valuable it is. From the outset, it looks like it's going to be extremely valuable, and I highly recommend it. It's actually not a bad price point. You can get it on Amazon.com. I think it's a fantastic book to pick up right now. Hey, if you're watching this and you're looking for someone a Christmas gift for someone, pick it up as a gift, right? It's got a good price point, but it's worth every penny. And when I get to reviewing this again in the future, I hope I'm able to say that statement just as much, just with as much authority and as much assurance as I can give you that yes, this is a good book to learn by. It's a good book to kind of give you a broad overview, but then also give you very specific things you can do to better yourself and better your use of the sword. And yeah, this book, it gets my full recommendation. Now, I will note, for matters of full disclosure, I do kind of tangentially know Mike. That is to say, like, we know each other on Facebook. We've met a bit, but realistically, I know him only to that extent. He knows of my channel. He actually provided this book for review. As is the typical thing with book reviews on my channel, I'm not really expected to send the book back. It's kind of used at this point. I've gotten my grubby mitts all over it, and I've actually been doing a couple things, so I've definitely damaged the book. I've been, reading it and bending pages by accident, and yeah, it happens. But this is one of those books I use as a practical manual, so I really expect it to get kind of beat up. There are electronic digital copies. Those will be updated, as I mentioned previously in this video. They'll be updated on a regular basis to ensure that they have the most up-to-date revisions, and those revisions might include minor corrections that are maybe incredibly vital. So whether you're getting the physical or digital version, I highly recommend this book. I highly recommend reading it cover to cover first, just understand what's being said, and then go back and maybe reread the theory section and then begin working on the drills and the practice. I think you could do drills and practice for a year and never even step up to tatami mat and learn more than people could learn if they just didn't have this book and kept cutting tatami mats all day long. And I think that's something that I've had to unlearn. I've had to unlearn that tatami mats in and of themselves are not good indications of how good you are at cutting. They're not necessarily the best way to actually learn. And there's actually a lot you can do with something sometimes as simple as a dowel, but certainly something as simple as a sword, and just going through the proper mechanics of cutting with it in a way that is sound, both with body mechanics as well as the fundamentals of power generation and edge alignment and all these other aspects of using a sword that we all innately understand, but none of us actually know it well enough to self-correct. And that's where this book is great. So this book, Cutting with Medieval Sword, both theory and application by Michael Edelson, gets my full recommendation. I highly value this book already. I was looking forward to it when I knew he was writing it. Excited to be able to suggest that, hey, you should go out there and pick it up. I hope you enjoyed this review. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can also check out Medieval Review on Patreon.